Madam Minister, Professor Edenhofer, Mr. Schönherr, dear audience in Germany, in Sweden, and in the rest of the world, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to this digital event on Corona and climate change. My name is Per Töresson. I'm the Swedish ambassador to Germany here in Berlin. Originally, we had planned to hold this event in June during the Sustainability Week, but for obvious reasons, we had to postpone it. And therefore, I'm very, very happy that we can have it today during the new term of the European Sustainable Development Week. I believe we have all seen in the past few months that the topic of today's discussion is just as relevant today as it was in the spring. Many governments all over the world, including the German and the Swedish ones, are currently preoccupied with plans for the recovery from the corona crisis. The key topic being, of course, how to make the recovery green and thus tackle the two major crises facing humanity, corona and climate change at the same time. And this summer, EU leaders agreed on the next generation EU recovery instrument. This deal paves the way for a green and resilient recovery to all EU spending. In her State of the Union speech last week, Ursula von der Leyen also announced that the European Commission wants to reduce EU greenhouse gases by at least 55% by 2030. And we firmly believe it's very important that all of us get involved. So this week, the Swedish Embassy in Berlin is organizing a number of events with climate as the common denominator. On Monday in Saxony, I opened an exhibition on Agenda 2030, which we plan to send out to all other states in Germany. Yesterday, all 5 Nordic ambassadors here in Berlin organized a Twitter town hall with questions on the Nordic climate policies. And earlier today, we also had a seminar with young Nordic voices, all engaged in solving the climate challenge in their different positions. Today, I think we can look forward to a very interesting discussion with our prominent guests. And we are very happy to have Professor Edenhofer from the Potsdam-Instituts for Climate Research, also recipient of this year's Environment Prize in Germany. Warm congratulations, Professor. Of course, very excited to have our Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Climate and the Environment, Isabella Lövin, with us from a studio in Stockholm. Great to see you again, Isabella. And of course, our moderator today, Christoph Schönherr. Mr. Schönherr is a strategy consultant with a history of leadership in the not-for-profit sector. He's a physicist with emphasis on climate change and also the coordinator of the International Networking of Scientists for Future. A warm welcome to all the 3 of you. And before I wrap up, I would also like to thank our partner, the United Nations Association of Germany, and in particular, Mr. Oliver Hasenkamp, for the excellent cooperation in preparing for this event. With your mandate as advocate for the United Nations and international cooperation, as well as your long-standing experience, you have again proven to be an ideal partner for us. So, without further ado, I will now leave the floor in the very good hands of Mr. Schönherr, who will guide us through the evening. Mr. Schönherr, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Töresson. Thank you very much for hosting us here at the Swedish Embassy in the complex of the Nordic embassies in Berlin, both personally and also virtually via Zoom. Which is a pandemically safe format and also very climate friendly because we're obviously reducing long distance travel and also commuting for most of us. Deputy Prime Minister Lövin, thank you very much for joining us here digitally from Stockholm. And thank you, Professor Edenhofer, for joining us here in person. And a warm welcome to the online audience. And thank you for taking the time for joining us today. I'm very honored to introduce our 2 guests to you as the audience. Minister Isabella Lövin. She's the Minister for Environment and Climate of the Swedish government and also the Deputy Prime Minister of Sweden. Previously, she held the positions of the International Development Cooperation and Climate Ministry, and also was a member of the European Parliament. She's a member of the Green Party of Sweden and has a background in political science, sociology, and journalism. And welcome to Professor Edenhofer, the Director and Chief Economist of the Potsdam-Instituts for Climate Impact Research, together with Professor Johan Rockström and Dr. Bettina Hörstrup as co-directors. You're also the Director of the Mercator Institute for research on global commons and climate change, and last but not least, Professor of Economics of Climate Change at the Technical University in Berlin. Thank you very much for joining. I will give you a brief overview of the schedule, which is actually quite tight. We have 1 hour in total until 6:30 Central European Time. First, I would like to invite Minister Lövin to speak, and then Professor Edenhofer to give their first introductory statements. Then subsequently, there will be time for questions, and then we'll end at 6:30. During the question and answer time, you're welcome in the audience to put your questions into the question and answer part of the Zoom tool, which is at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we will collect your questions and then pose a selection of those questions to our 2 guests. Minister Lövin, Professor Edenhofer, as Ambassador Thoresen mentioned, the governments across Europe and around the world are tackling 2 major crises in parallel, the COVID-19 crisis and the climate crisis. From your particular vantage points, would you kindly share your insights on the lessons that we can learn from the pandemic when addressing the climate change? In particular, we're interested in hearing from you, which are the key elements for creating a sustainable and climate-friendly society during and after the pandemic? Which role could the United Nations play, in particular, to advance the implementation of the Paris Agreement and create new momentum for climate action? And last but not least, what can Sweden and Germany learn from each other, and how can they both best together support the efforts of the European Union in the context of the Green New Deal? So without further extending this list of complex questions, I would like you, Minister Lövin, to invite you to share with us your consideration on this topic. Thank you. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you also for arranging this very important discussion at a very crucial point in our history. We really live in very, very turbulent times with the pandemic, but also with a climate crisis. So the topic of this afternoon is not only a topic that is discussed here in Sweden or in the EU or Germany, but around the world and in all societies. COVID-19 has caused a global crisis and has in many ways exposed the vulnerability of a modern society. And I participated last week at an OECD ministerial roundtable. And my Chilean colleague, she said, well, we've some of us been in a quarantine, but the climate crisis has not been in a quarantine during this year. On the contrary, it's moving in a frightening pace, and it's that's why it's so important that we combine the recovery from the COVID-19 with our work to tackle climate change. The climate crisis is an ongoing crisis. It has not gone away. We're faced with a choice of how to steer the recovery from COVID-19. Now, if all countries base the recovery, the economic stimulus packages on the structure of our present economy, the way that the world did after the economic crisis in 2008 and 2009, well, we will lock in our societies in a fossil fuel dependency for decades to come. Even if this might contribute to kickstarting our economies in the short term, it will lead us even quicker to the other crisis, the climate crisis. Instead, I believe that we should and we can focus on the path of a green recovery by reshaping our economies towards climate neutrality and, of course, living up to our responsibility to future generations and to our own children. And we all know the message of our children with the movement of Fridays for Future and Greta and all her equivalents around the globe. Now, we can achieve a real recovery by stimulating the parts of the economy that could bring us closer to a climate neutral future. By focusing on renewable energy, by focusing on industrial climate transition. And we know that this isn't really something that will hamper economic development, quite the opposite. Already today, 4 million people across the EU work in the green sector. And this number will increase substantially with the policies and actions that will be introduced to reach climate neutrality by 2050, which has been shown by the EU Commission. The focus on this session today is on lessons learned. So let me give you a few examples of green recovery measures that me and my government has launched and worked with during the last couple of months. First of all, the focus has been on green transition. We already had set that target for ourselves to become a fossil-free welfare state, but now we really see the opportunity to accelerate that transition. The Prime Minister has set up a ministerial working group on climate policy, in which a group of ministers make sure that we integrate climate action in all our work and all our policy areas. And of course, as a climate minister, it's not under my mandate to do all the transition that is needed, but also the Minister for Agriculture or for Industry and all the other ministers have to be on board to make the real transition. And step by step, we are approaching some really interesting I would say, transitions in the sector of the industry. And a few weeks ago, I participated at the launch of the world's first pilot plant for fossil-free steel in northern Sweden. This is really going to be a game changer. It's a great example of industry transition, and it's happening here and now. And I was very proud to hear President of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen, mentioning this pilot plant in her State of the Union last week, because this really has the potential of real transformation of the steel industry across the world, which would mean a reduction of global emissions by some 6%. Another lesson from this COVID crisis is that previously launched platforms or initiatives quickly and effectively can start working and focus also on green recovery measures. Since 2015, we have an initiative called Fossil Free Sweden, which gathers some 450 enterprises, municipalities, associations, and other actors that are cooperating with the goal of Sweden being fossil-free by 2045. This initiative will work together with businesses to enable a green recovery. And of course, we're supporting that by big investments in the state budget for next year. We have proposed investments of equivalent to €1 billion to green recovery initiatives in the budget bill for 2021. And we strongly believe that investments in industry's climate transition, sustainable transport, and biodiversity will help us emerge from the crisis. But it will also create new jobs and contribute to human health, and also strengthen our competitiveness. Lastly, I would like to end on a positive note. This COVID crisis has taught us that we are able to act very quickly when we are in a crisis. We've seen unprecedented measures being taken all across the world to save lives and protect human health. And I hope and I believe that the world can come together as decisively, as inventively when it comes to solve the climate crisis as well. Now, I look forward to listening to the introductory words from Professor Edenhofer, and then to participate in an interesting dialogue with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Lövin, for your very informative remarks. And thank you for staying with us until the end for the questions. And so I would like to invite Professor Edenhofer now to take the podium.
Yeah, Madam Minister, Ambassador, it's a great pleasure to be here. When I had to deliver such a speech, let's say 4 weeks ago, my speech would start like in the following way. I would say during the COVID crisis, we have reduced in the lockdown our emissions to the level only of 2006. And what we have learned in the past from the financial crisis, that the economic growth will come back very soon, but also the emissions growth will jump to the original trajectory. This is what we have seen after the financial crisis. Basically, there is only a little bit of delay in the trajectory of the emissions. And then I would continue and say, what we have seen so far in 2020, shockingly, that many countries have invested still in coal. In a remarkable way, China invested more in coal than in 2019. Bangladesh, Vietnam, Indonesia, they had large-scale investment projects, and investment projects in coal, which have been shelved before the COVID crisis, came back into the pipeline because many countries perceive coal as an investment which has high fiscal multipliers. And I would end my speech on a very pessimistic note. Now, I'm a little bit more optimistic, and I would like to explain you why. Let me start at the international scale. Of course, we have a postponement of COP26, but we have the announcement of China to become carbon neutral by 2060, which is an enormous announcement from my point of view. And even more importantly, they have indicated they will peak their emissions in 2030. So this is really a sign for hope. And I believe that due to this announcement of China, EU would now be in a much better position to launch talks with the smaller Asian countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh. Vietnam, for example, has announced a moratorium for coal investments over the next 10 years, not the phase out, but at least the moratorium. Here we can work on this. So at an international scale, I was for a very long time very skeptical about the United Nations framework and about this process. We are stuck basically in negotiations about nitty-gritty details on Article 6. But still, there is now room for creating coalitions among larger countries, and in particular between Europe and China, with all the difficulties and all the problems. Now let me move on to add, which adds to my optimism, it's the European level. And I deeply believe that the European Green Deal is a game changer. Again, when policymakers have announced a new target in the past, I was not impressed at all. Because announcing targets is a game which we have seen over the last 10 years, again and again, but this time I believe it's different. Why it's different? Let me explain this. So Ursula von der Leyen not only announced a 55% target, a new target, which tightens emissions reduction, I would say yes, that in itself is remarkable, but what is more remarkable is that this new target creates a new momentum to change institutional settings even in the EU member states. And this is worthwhile to be explained a little bit more. First, even it is open to debate to what extent this 55% will be delivered mainly by the industry sector and the power sector or by the non-ETS sectors. This is open to debate, but whatever will happen, we will see very likely a remarkable increase in the CO2 price in the European emissions trading scheme. And this will facilitate a coal phase out at a much higher pace in Germany, but not only in Germany, but also in Poland. Poland has changed completely the mindset. Poland is now at the edge of a fundamental change in the energy system. And this will be facilitated by a reform of the European emissions trading scheme. Now there will be discussions to what extent new sectors should be included in the EU ETS, or to create an emissions trading scheme for the current non-ETS sectors for transport, heating, building, and agriculture. We will see what will happen, but it is for sure that the investors on the market expect a higher CO2 price, and this higher CO2 price will kick off a fundamental transformation. I would even argue that the announcement of the 55 target plus the carbon neutrality by 2050 will set all the sectors into an almost irreversible motion. We will see a lot of problems, no doubt about this. We will see a lot of frictions. We will see a lot of necessity of adjustments. Some people even argue that we can expect a regulatory monster wave. That's true, but this is an enormous opportunity now to set the incentives right, that the enormous amount of money which is now invested in Europe and outside Europe can be invested in the right directions, in the right technologies, in the right sectors. And when we look at, I apologize for referring to Germany, because as a German, it is much more easier to blame my own country than to other countries. But there is not too much to blame, because in Germany, we have set up a phase out of coal. We have decided a national emissions trading scheme for the transport, heating, and building sector. But what can be taken for granted, we need a fundamental adjustment of this institutional setting because of these new EU targets. So in that sense, I would say it's a fascinating time that we are now in the middle of this post-corona crisis. In the middle of this post-corona crisis, we see now really signs for hope at the international, the UN scale, the EU scale, and at the national level. I would say this is something which I haven't seen so far since I am working in this area of climate and energy policy. So, despite of my natural pessimism, we Germans are like slightly pessimistic all the time. So, and I feel very much a duty to be pessimistic. But today, I have to say, I should be modestly optimistic.
Thank you, Professor Edenhofer, for this very optimistic statement. If I may explore just there a little further, you said that the CO2 price is likely going to be going up, and that would set up in motion a whole chain reaction of betterment, so to say. Mm-hmm. What would you see from your perspective as the possible obstacles to that? That it's actually not going to go by itself. What would we need to be watchful for?
Yeah, the interesting thing is that it is not decided yet, to be honest. So what's the division of labor between the so-called ETS sector, which basically is industry and power, the power sector, and the non-ETS sector. But whatever we do, we might decide that the industry and the power sector has to deliver more, or the other sectors, we will see a change in prices. And when in one of the sectors, CO2 prices are increasing, so investors form expectations about the future. And what we see now is that the reduction of emissions, the lion's share of emission reduction in Germany is due to the increase of the CO2 price.
Minister Lövin, if I may come back and ask you a question. From your perspective, comparing the COVID crisis as a sudden and unexpected crisis, where many drastic changes have been made and imposed on people's personal lives, and largely accepted actually in societies all across Europe, measures that seemed unimaginable only 12 months ago. How would you see that in light of a longer term crisis like climate change, where it has been, like, for the last decades, like 4 decades or so, been quite difficult for people to accept, like, measures that might be needed to get the situation under control in the long run? What do you see as, like, the key factors there so that we can progress even in a crisis that is on a very different time scale?
I think that's an extremely interesting question. And of course, the first ever global UN environment conference was held in Stockholm in 1972. It's almost 50 years ago. We have known about climate change and the approaching climate crisis for so long. And still we see that the environmental problems and the climate crisis is ever increasing and really threatening basically our civilization. So why can't we react on that with the same decisiveness as we've reacted to the COVID-19 crisis? I think that might be a psychological problem, but it's also indeed a political problem, because I think what we can learn from the COVID-19 response and what the world has been able to do in such a short time, unthinkable measures, has given us kind of a space to rethink the way we are living, that it's not to be taken for granted exactly the notion of progress and how everyone has really spent their time with the goal of consuming more and more, equaling more and more satisfaction and welfare. But I think this is an opportunity for the whole world to rethink where we're going, and also reshaping the narrative of what is welfare, what is well-being in a society, what is solidarity, where do we want to go. And we really have an opportunity now when recovering from the economic crisis, and it's not over yet. I think we must be very cautious of talking about post-corona already, because it's not post-corona. We don't have a vaccine. We don't know when we're going to be able to live as we used to, in terms of how we can meet without being afraid of this contagion. So I think this is the time where we can reshape the narrative of where we want to go. And what the professor said about these positive signs about China, about the Green Deal, that lays the foundations for us to really seriously mean what we say when we want to get out of fossil fuels. And I can really sense and hear from my colleagues around the world, from the private sector, which I have a very close dialogue with here in Sweden, that now for the first time, the last year or so, I can hear them really meaning what they say when we are going to get out of fossil fuels. And for instance, one big refinery of fossil fuels in our neighboring country, Finland, here now, just announced that they are going to close because there's no profitability in that sector now. And that's a real sign that we are going here, and we are using policy instruments such as a CO2 tax in Sweden, which has been very, very effective in phasing out oil from the heating sector in people's houses and private homes just 2 decades ago, and now we see that the pricing in the ETS sector is doing a lot of good when it comes to coal and phasing out coal. And we have the instruments, and we also have the alternatives to this old technique and the old way of living. So really, we must treat this crisis as an opportunity, because it is, and we can reshape the narrative of where we're going with our societies. And this is really a very, very exciting time.
Thank you very much. You mentioned that we now mean what we say. And I was wondering, from your perspective in the Swedish government, what are the major points to bring all the European Union countries to rally behind the European Green Deal in solidarity? And so what does it take to actually really mean what we say on that level? And in particular, actually, since Germany has now the presidency of the Council of the European Union until the end of 2020, how do you see the role of Germany over the next few months in that role to advancing the Green Deal?
Well, to answer the last question first, I think Germany has an immensely important role, both as a member state, but of course as the president of the European Union now for the next months. We need to deliver on an enhanced goal for 2030. I very much welcome the Commission's proposal of at least minus 55%. We also need to submit our enhanced NDC to UNCCC and really show leadership for the world. And I think that the German presidency has a very important role there. Now, how are we going to get all the member states to rally behind the enhanced ambitions? I mean, I think it's important to, of course, give support. We have the Just Transition Fund. We have many other instruments, not least with the recovery funds for the European Union now, post-COVID. But also to show by example. And as I mentioned in my introduction, I was very, very really proud when Ursula von der Leyen mentioned the pilot plant steel production in Sweden, because the steel production across the world is a really substantial contributor to climate change by using a technique that was basically invented 1,000 years ago. With the old coal mines that produce steel from iron ore. And now we have a new technique by using green, clean hydrogen. And it's possible to do. We've invested from the Swedish side, from the government side, in this pilot plant. And I already hear from colleagues in Germany, from across the world, from India, they want to come and they want to see. And basically once one heavy industry like the steel industry, when they have examples that can show you can do the transition, the technology leap that you need to do, then others will follow. So I think we need to really work to get these positive examples. And I know that they're there, but to unleash the potential, governments need to work with the industry. And with research and innovation, provide resources, make these partnerships work. And once one sector takes the lead, others will follow. And this is, we don't have any time to waste anymore. And I think this, when I said, well, people are starting to believe what they're saying, but they need to see that it's possible, and it is possible. And that's very important work for all of us to do. And I think the Green Deal, as the professor mentioned, is really a huge step forward and can unleash a lot of innovation across Europe.
Thank you very much for emphasizing that, showing that it's possible is so important, and giving good examples. Before I come to the next question to Professor Edenhofer, I would like to remind the audience that you can please use the question and answer tool in Zoom and pose more questions if you like. We still have about 25 minutes until the end of this session here. So, Professor Edenhofer, last week you mentioned, or you were quoted actually, with a quote about Peter Altmaier, the German Minister for the Economy, and his recent 20 points plan for the climate, and which is called the Charter for Climate Neutrality and Economic Strength. And you said that his proposal is actually quite remarkable, and that Minister Altmaier might have the potential to become something like entering the history books as the Ludwig Erhard of the energy transition, similar to the economic miracle post-war in Germany. From your point of view, what are the most important points that he mentioned among those 20, and do you see any obstacles in implementing those?
I always see obstacles. That's my job as an academic, and in particular as a German professor, to highlight obstacles. But one thing is really remarkable in this 20 point plan. It says, at least in my interpretation, that Germany now wants to change, or is willing to have a paradigm shift towards not only achieve carbon neutrality, but also to use carbon pricing as the most important policy tool to do this. And let me highlight this, why this is, from my point of view, very important. Over the last, I would say, even over the last 30 years, environmental policy was extremely successful with regulatory measures, extremely successful. But environmental policy has never given the task to transform a whole economy. So we have never done such a thing. So what we are doing now, what we are supposed to do, is to decouple economic growth from emissions. And it is not just that we decouple that a little bit. In the end, we need zero emissions. Zero emissions. And this basically can only be done when all the sectors are transformed. And this is something which is unprecedented, and I would even say it's very hard to find a situation, a historical situation, where economies have done this. Probably you might say such a transformation was at stake when China basically transformed the central planned economy to a more market economy. You might think about Eastern Europe. But anyway, I do not care about this historical images. The most important thing is it is a large-scale transformational change, a large-scale structural change. We have never done such a thing before. Then we have to think about what tools are at hand to do this. And the most important thing is that we are talking now about technologies, green steel, electromobility. Of course, these are wonderful alternatives, but in fact, nobody knows, and nobody can predict technological progress. I'm very blunt and directly about this. Show me somebody who can tell the technological progress. I don't believe this. So including my own projections and predictions about technological sense are all completely wrong. What does this mean for setting up a regulatory framework? The most important thing is you have to give room for innovation. And you have to do this in a way that basically you create incentives for innovation. And the most important tool, I'm not saying it's the only tool, but the most important tool are indeed price signals. Because price signals are understood by the consumers, they are understood by the investors, they are understood by the financial sector. And here I would like to highlight one important thing. And this is also a very remarkable aspect. A new actor is now entering the stage. And these are the central banks, the European Central Bank, and other institutional investors. They are now really very interested not only in the risk of climate impacts, like extreme weather events and so on. This is for them a very important issue, but also to deal with regulatory and the transformative risks. One thing is, of course, stranded assets. There are many studies commissioned by the central banks asking the question, is the transformation of our economies a reason to be concerned about the financial stability because we create so much financial assets? We come to the conclusion, if it is managed well, this is shouldn't be a big problem, but you can see what is at stage and how deep this transformation is, that basically central banks, finance ministries, institutional investors are now interested in this issue. Now our task is, and this is a huge challenge, to come up with a regulatory framework where the business can operate. And my understanding is that the business community is now prepared to do this, but they are asking the policymakers, the regulators, to come up with something which is really creates a space, creates an environment where basically the environmental friendly innovation can flourish.
Thank you. So we have a few questions from the audience now, which first of which I will read to you. Here's a question from Anne Harting from the Federal Foreign Office here in Germany. Science plays a strong role in climate policy and also in fighting the pandemic. Still, politics cannot only follow scientific advice, but also aims at balancing interest groups like business, social stakeholders, and environmentalists. How do you strike this balance in Sweden, Deputy Prime Minister Lövin?
Well, thank you very much for that question. Of course, we have a very famous youth movement from Sweden, which has kind of the slogan, Unite Behind the Science, which Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future so rightly point that we are not following the advice or the knowledge provided by our scientists so far. But I also think it's important that we must believe that we can make this transition through policy measurements that are very clear. Professor Edenhofer talked about price signals. I think that is really an important tool to use, but also stating very clear goals. And when it comes to bringing the industry along, or bringing the private sector and those that need to do the job, then we created this platform in Sweden called Fossil Free Sweden, where we basically gathered all the big emitters and we said, hey, you are going to do this job. We have the Swedish Parliament has set the target of net zero emissions by 2045. In 25 years, we all need to be there. So what do you need? What obstacles do you see in order to get there? So by now we have some 20 roadmaps from different sectors, from the forestry, from the steel sector, from the heavy transports, from agriculture sector is coming along, and the major emitters. So if you bring all these roadmaps together, they are encompassing some 70% of Swedish emissions. So they show what is needed in order for us as a country to get to net zero emissions. And then we need to work with forms for testing, pilot plants, innovation, and the connections to academia and to innovation. So we're basically trying to bring everything together. And I think more and more, there's a very positive atmosphere in Sweden around this. Of course, environmentalists, and I count myself as an environmentalists, are very concerned that it's not going in the speed required by science. However, I think we cannot see the reduction in emissions in a linear way, but we will see it step by step once we get the right measures in place. And I'm very happy that we, with the policies that we presented last week, we see that we are going to get to our targets by 2030 when it comes to the transport sector. And then we need to work much more with the industry. But we're working, and I think we have been able to create a positive atmosphere in Sweden. And basically, I hope that we as a small country can show by example that it's possible to do.
Thank you very much. There was actually a second part to this question to Professor Edenhofer, and that is, which part of your advice is disregarded most by politics?
Yeah, let me say, before I answer that question directly, a scientist cannot expect and should not expect that his policy advice will be implemented immediately. I think that is, from my point of view, a completely wrong perception what science can and has to deliver. As scientists, we do not come up with categorical imperatives. What we can do is we can ask the question, so to say, first of all, in climate science, we are in a position to make very clear what are the impacts of climate change. So the international community comes up then with the Paris Agreement, arguing and stating that we should limit the increase of global mean temperature below 2 degrees. But the pathways to that there are multiple pathways. It's not just one. And as scientists, when we want to give advice, so we can only be explicit about the different pathways, inform policymakers about the risks and so on. So I don't want to come across that there is just one pathway, just one solution, and there is no alternative. And there is no room for compromise. Sometimes compromises in democracies are good, sometimes compromises are weak. And again, we can say this as scientists, but for me it is very important that as scientists we cannot prescribe how people should live. So this is something where everybody has a competence, everybody should have a say, and the future development of our society. So when some people say united behind science, this means we respect the insights of science. We want to do this in an enlightened way, but there is a deep, let's say, a deep understanding about facts and values in our societies. And most of us have been trained, people, elderly people like me, when they are young academics, there's a clear distinction between facts and values. So science is responsible for the facts, and the values, the value judgments are up to the policymakers and the public. And this is not true. Facts and values are intertwined, and this is so complicated how to speak. And what I'm saying is that the only thing what we can do as a service to the society, being explicit about the underlying value judgments. But this is unavoidable. So, and what advice is mostly ignored, I would say over the last 10 years, the importance of price signals, the importance of carbon pricing has been ignored so far. But we made progress. And the most important thing is scientists should never say, I'm ignored. We should say, let's try to come up to organize a social learning process where the decision makers in politics and the business can learn, but also we as scientists have to learn. And I would like to give you an example of what I learned over the last few years. When I started as a younger economist talking about policymakers, I always entered the door and said, look, I explain you what is the most efficient way. But policymakers are not interested primarily in efficiency. And this is quite obvious. Now it's obvious for me, because policymakers are concerned about distributional issues. Distributional issues are very, very often ignored by economists. So therefore, if you want to be relevant for the decision makers, you have to say something on distributional concerns. Last year, the CO2 price reform in Germany was only feasible because in the end, we made some reasonable proposals how to address distributional concerns, because it's a matter of fact, climate policy in general and carbon pricing in particular impacts the low-income households. So you have to deal with that. So, and that's a very sound and a reasonable way, and I hope so. The other side has also learned something, and I think, from my point of view, policymakers should realize this huge transformation process. We cannot afford very huge price differentials across the sectors, because this is socially and politically not feasible. So, and over time, I hope we can learn from each other, but we shouldn't be so arrogant as academics and scientists. So we have the truth, and the bad word of politics ignores that. That's too simple.
Thank you. There's a question about which role cities play in both combating climate change and causing it, and also in the recovery process from COVID-19. Cities need support from national governments. And what are, in your view, the most important areas for national governments to support a sustainable transformation in cities in particular? Maybe to both of you. Minister Lövin, if you'd like to start.
Microphone. Well, thank you. No, I think cities have an enormously important role to play in the transformation. And what can we do from the policy side to facilitate good initiatives and let's say more sustainable way of building our cities and living in the cities? We have provided a co-financing scheme called Good Environments for Cities, where the municipalities can apply for co-financing, for instance, for collective transport, for bike lanes, for green infrastructure in the cities, and planning for housing in an environmentally sound and smart way. So they can really plan for both housing and transport and everything connected to that. So it's possible to live in a more sustainable way. So that has been a positive program. It's been running now for some 5 years, and we continue to do that. And I think there's a lot of potential with cities to make their own targets to reduce emissions, but also combine that with plans to make cities better for people to live in, with less traffic, less noise, less air pollution, and better spaces for people to meet and to live, for children to play. So that is, I think, a real win-win. And I think also with the COVID-19, since that is also the theme of what we're talking about now, there's a lot of space for thinking new around how we want to see our cities. Our people are more and more working at home now, so there's I think a lot of new thinking around how we can live and how that can give us a quality of life.
Thank you. Professor Edenhofer, how do you see the role of cities?
So there are many aspects, but I would like to pick one aspect, and this is the link to transport. So if you think a little bit about transport, of course, cars produce emissions when they come from the combustion engine. But cars are only producing noise and they are also producing, they are increasing local air pollution and in particular congestion. So, and all the cities around the globe, not only in Asia, but also in the European cities, it seems to me that for example, congestion will become a huge problem. Local air pollution is a huge problem. And the nice thing is with that is this is very tangible for citizens, right? So the CO2 part is only a very indirect way to think about this, but congestion and noise and local air pollution, this is very much direct related. What we ignore very often is how important the reduction of local air pollution is for public health. So in that sense, the transformation of the transport sector provides for cities a splendid opportunity to improve quality of life in cities. And also they have tools at hand. Of course, most of the cities are not in a position to impose a CO2 tax. But one very, very important tool will become the congestion charges. And how, so the time is over where we can just build new streets in order to handle the congestion. So we have to do this with the given capacities. And electromobility and such kind of things might help us to do this. We just are running a huge project for Berlin, where we try to figure out, so what would be a congestion charge to reduce congestion in Berlin? Digitalization would provide us a splendid opportunity to do this congestion charging in a very efficient, in a very easy way. So these are things which are very important, and I would perceive the cities as a very important laboratory for the transformation process. So when we talked about the power sector and the industry sector, cities had not too much leverage. But when it comes to transport, cities have the tools at hand, and they can be very much more proactive in implementing this. And many of these things are also quite contentious, might create social conflicts. But again, the cities are the social laboratory for that.
Thank you. Thank you to both of you. Unfortunately, we're coming to an end very soon here. I would love to continue the very, very inspiring and interesting conversation, but this needs to remain for another time. So if I may ask you, maybe first you, Professor Edenhofer, for a final statement of what makes you most hopeful in this situation of the crisis.
Yeah, to be honest, I don't like to talk about the COVID crisis and say, yeah, this crisis is just wonderful. I don't think it is just wonderful. It's a problem. So I don't wish that we are in a crisis. But given the fact that we are in a crisis, so I have to say what makes me modestly hopeful is, again, that governments, and in particular democracies, so that's my democracies responded very reasonably to the crisis. And I would say I'm quite concerned about this, that there's the system competition between democracies and autocracies. That's a huge thing. And we should not take democracy for granted. And I think we have to improve our democratic institutions. That is enormously important. And what gives me hope is that now people realize what democracies can deliver, but this should also be for us an incentive to think more how to make democracies work, to perform better, because this is something which is enormously important, and we are in the middle of a system competition. And this is something where I really hope that Europe, here I would like to highlight that I am a really passionate European. I hope that Europe can stand up to these huge challenges.
Thank you. We certainly all hope. Minister Lövin, what makes you most hopeful?
Well, I think the fact that we're having all these conversations now, and we really have the time to reflect on the future and what we want the future to be. And it's been like an emergency break for the whole world with the COVID-19 pandemic. I certainly don't want to say that this is something that is positive, but it's something that really shows us how vulnerable our societies are and that we must build back better. And I think that the recognition, the insight in people about that fact has really not only led us to discuss at these conferences, but also in people's living rooms, at the kitchen tables, that people are really starting to ask themselves some questions about how we should live in a better and more sustainable way. We don't know if we will have more pandemics in the future, but probably we will. But we are also can be very, very certain that we will have a climate crisis as we act upon what we know about that. So what makes me hopeful is that we have a lot of tools, we've already done a lot of work, and that I think the hesitation about doing the transition is going away, is moving away. And I was very, very encouraged by the EU Commission's Green Deal, also by, of course, what China stated about going for net zero emissions by 2060. And that we're moving in that direction. And if we just keep our eyes on the goal, we will get there. But it would be a lot of work, of course. So we just need to continue doing that work.
Thank you very much for these inspiring words, and thank you to both of you, Minister Lövin and Professor Edenhofer, for joining us today, this afternoon. Thank you, Ambassador Töresson, for hosting us here in the Embassy of Sweden, and also to all the staff of the Swedish Embassy, and of course to the staff of the United Nations Association of Germany. And thank you also for the amazing technical team who made this all work and connected us over long distances and short distances for this wonderful afternoon. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.